4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Bounce. There we go. 1, 2. So I could take that down, or you going to take that down there? Actually, that's a good level. Okay. I'll run around the other mics in a sec. two, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2, 1 2. Ha ha. Hey, 1 2, 1 2. Hey, why am I not hearing that in the monitor? 1 2, 1 2.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Now, you see, that's the level of discussion that we want throughout the rest of the day. So you just keep this going, but after our speakers. So, welcome, everyone. Really delighted to see you all here this morning. Really delighted to be hosting our annual conference back in Edinburgh again, the first time in at least 10 years that we've hosted a major conference here. So, really pleased to see you all here, and welcome to those of you who are joining online. A couple of housekeeping points, as always, before we start. There's no fire drill expected, so if the fire alarm goes or an automated voice tells us to leave the building, then please do so by the fire exit so you can see, and staff at the venue will help us out. There's a photographer, as you've probably noted already, around the venue. If you don't want your picture taken, just let us know. Let someone in the team know. We're also, throughout the day, using the hashtag #MakingChange on social media. So if you're still one of those few people who are using Twitter, then you can use it on there. If you've joined us all on Blue Sky, then you can do that, or Instagram, or wherever you find yourself. We want the discussion to take place, not just in this room, but outside. The workshops, they're on your badges. The Carrick Suite, the Kilsyth, the Tinto, Moorcroft and Harris. It's very Scottish. So that's on your badge. Staff can help guide you to those workshops when they come after this session. And finally, anyone who's claiming expenses to be here today, if you could see Isla at the main registration desk at lunchtime, she'll be able to help you out, or someone from the admin team will be able to help. So that's the housekeeping done. We're coming here together today at the end of a year that was billed at the start of this year as being a big one for democracy. There were more than 4 billion people estimated to have the right to vote in new leaders and new governments this year. But I think what we've seen throughout this year too often is less a festival of democracy, and what we've actually witnessed is a deepening of polarisation, a worrying rise in right-wing nationalism, and the continued decline in trust in politics and politicians. And for those of us who are seeking progressive change, which is all of us in this room, I think, who want to address poverty in all its forms, who want to reverse the decline in living standards, tackle discrimination, or make sure that everyone has a decent home, that divided and divisive context is a serious challenge. So today's conference is all about how we address that challenge. How do we make change happen when it can sometimes feel like the odds are stacked against us? Now, I firmly believe, many of you who know me will know that I'm an optimist and a hopeful person, but I firmly believe that despite this really difficult context, there are still opportunities to make progress, still opportunities where we can defend and expand rights, where we can make progressive policy and real change in communities at the local level. But that progress can only come from us in civil society when we act together. So what we'll spend today doing is how we figure out how best to act together, how we combine our resources, how we learn from each other, how we can use different strategies to make change happen. We've got a host of fantastic speakers here, and I really will encourage you to take an active part in today's discussion, to listen, to engage with those speakers and all the other participants here today. We all have contributions to make when it comes to making change happen. Now, something a wee bit different this year at our annual conference. Almost every year we have a senior politician to open the discussion. And you'll have noted from the agenda that this is a politician-free event. And I think that's in keeping with the theme of today, and to use that old saying or old quote, I think Obama used to use it a lot, but it's not his, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. This is a year for us as the Poverty Alliance to consider how we marshal our resources, how we prioritise and work together. And to be honest, we don't really need another politician coming here to tell us how tough it is to make the tough decisions that they have to make. We know that, we hear that. We don't need to hear it in this room today. What we have instead is to open our session today, 3 really powerful and inspirational speakers, ones who have been working hard to make social, economic and environmental change happen. We're going to hear from each of them in turn and then have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So first, I'd like to introduce Danish Suskandaraja, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the New Economics Foundation. Danny, as I'm sure many of you will know, has had a long career leading a number of really important global civil society organisations. Oxfam GB, Civicus, the Royal Commonwealth Society. That's a wealth of experience that Danny is bringing here today on how civil society around the world is responding to the challenges that we face. He's going to share with us some of that knowledge and some of the key lessons that emerge in his recent new book, Power to the People, which I really can't recommend highly enough. It's an excellent book. Something for Christmas, perhaps. So, with no further ado, Danny, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I came up from London last night. I love coming to Scotland for lots of reasons, not just the Iron Brew, but because whenever I come, it feels like there's always a different energy here when it comes to social justice, to equality, to fairness, and whether it's the conversations you're having about the minimum income guarantee with your government, whether it's the wonderful work that my former colleagues in Oxfam Scotland are doing around inequality and making polluters pay. There is a real energy that I wish we had more of down south in Westminster. I also love coming here because you do some fantastic events, and the very last time I was in this building was a couple of years ago for the People's Postcode Lottery Gala dinner. I don't know if anyone was here. And a little-known Scottish band called Texas performed. And I want to quote Charlene Spiteri to begin. So this is from Black Eyed Boy, a famous song from Texas in the late 90s. And this is going to be what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes. No, I don't lack ambition. Can't you see what I hate? That it's you who is sinking, locked behind iron gates. You should know you're falling into fiction. I can tell you're on some foolish mission. And I want to use those words because I think that after 20-odd years of knocking about in civil society, trying to make change happen, I've come to the conclusion, and that's what the book is all about, is that if we're going to have any chance of succeeding in our mission of making the world far more just, far more sustainable, we have to get smart about how the system is working against us. Those of us who are interested in ending poverty and in empowering people have been sort of watching in horror about what is happening, not just in our own country, but around the world in the last few years. You know, we thought we were riding this amazing wave of growth, of development, that everyone in the world would be richer and better off, that the rising tide will lift all boats. But instead, the very opposite is happening. Almost everywhere in the world, poverty and inequality is rising. Almost everywhere in the world, we're not doing enough to avoid disastrous climate breakdown. Always everywhere in the world, the deep injustices that have kept women from fully achieving their potential, that have kept racialized minorities from fully achieving their potential, that have kept people living with disabilities from fully achieving their potential. Those injustices are still there. They're stubbornly holding on and preventing a genuine equality. And I've been asking myself, why? Why is that? And I think there are three things that we need to do that I want to just talk briefly about. They're all about systemic change. One is about changing the way that our economy works. Two is about changing the way that our politics work. And three is changing the way that we work in civil society. I want to cover off each in turn. So let's turn to the economy. I work at the New Economics Foundation these days. It was created exactly 40 years ago. In 1984, Margaret Thatcher was hosting the G7 leaders, including Ronald Reagan, in London, and a bunch of ecologists and alternative economists were worried that what became called Thatcherism or Reaganomics or neoliberalism, they were worried at the time, 40 years ago, that left unchecked, this neoliberal orthodoxy would ravage the planet, would leave us all feeling worse off, would pull back the state and the protections that were so hard won, the labor rights that were hard won. And for 40 years, there's an organization that's been trying to challenge that orthodoxy. And here we are in 2024, and I think we have lost the battle on so many fronts, and we need to, I think, come together and say, if we're going to have any chance of ending poverty, of reducing it meaningfully, we have to change the way that the economy works. But I'm here, Peter told me, to inspire you for action and to make today feel positive. And the reason I'm here and the reason I'm so excited about civil society and our role is I think the key to unleashing a genuinely inclusive economy sits in rooms like this. Like if I were to say, who is going to help transform society? Is it the state? Is it business? Or is it citizens, activists, people like us? I'd put money on us. Because I think the really exciting bits of fundamentally redrawing our economy, I think, sit within civil society. I'm really excited, for example, about what's happening in the cooperative sector. So 3% of the UK GDP is produced by cooperatives of one form or another. Some of them are decades, hundreds of years old. And so the answer, if we really want to have a more equitable society, a more equal economy, I think in part lies in really strengthening the work of what's happening in cooperatives. And I'm inspired by what's happening by community energy groups who are building renewable energy initiatives, but through community ownership. I'm excited about the Equal Care Cooperative. The idea that social care, which is so chronically undervalued in society, where caregivers, those who are paid, are so chronically underpaid, that the solution to that is not just fighting for rights and minimum wage and standards, that's really important, but trying to think ahead and say, how do we create a care economy that itself treats everyone involved with greater dignity? And to me, that is about mutualism and cooperativism. So there's an example there about how we can tackle or make the economy work fairer. Let me give you another example of some amazing, brave activism around the economy. One, that it's about wealth and the fact that we have been sleepwalking into an inequality crisis around wealth. How is it possible that in the last 14 years, in this country, in the UK, that if you happen to have been in the top 1% of wealth holders in 2010, by this year, your average per capita wealth has increased by £2.2 million. 41 times more than the average increase in wealth experienced by the average British person. And yet, we tax wealth so low compared to how we, those of us who have to earn a living through hard work get taxed a certain rate. That's important. If we want to pay for our public services, we need to make our contribution. But if you happen to collect your income because you own assets and those assets are increasing in value, society says we can't tax you. And it's not just in the UK. Only 4% of taxes globally are collected on wealth of some form or another, 96% through work or consumption. That's not right in a world where the wealth holders are getting eye-wateringly rich or richer. But why am I bringing it back to civil society? Well, I came back from Rio de Janeiro last week from the G20 summit, which is the 20 biggest economies in the world. Those sort of conversations that have been happening over the last few years that have been all about driving globalization, driving productivity or whatever, all the buzzwords that economists usually talk about. I came away inspired because for the first time in that communique that leaders agreed to last week in Rio is a recognition that the global economy is not sustainable unless we do something about wealth inequality. that the G20 leaders have agreed that they will explore creating a tax on the super rich. They're going to start, I hope, with billionaires, the several thousand people who are billionaires. And if you'd asked me 3 or 4 years ago, would G20 leaders, the leaders of the biggest economy in the world, agree that wealth inequality was a problem? I said, no, don't be silly. They're never going to do that. But why are they doing that? Why have they done that? It's because of the activism and the persistence of people in rooms like this, who've worked tirelessly to make the case for why we need international coordinated action on wealth inequality. It's people who've been looking at the research, producing the research, the evidence to say that actually poverty exists in today's world, not because of scarcity, but because of maldistribution. That the real problem is inequality that's driving poverty. And so whether it's cooperatives or whether it's campaigning on wealth taxes, it's people in rooms like this that are going to make this change we need happen to fundamentally rewire our economy so that we can end poverty for good. Politics, and Peter said this just now, is supposed to be the system, or the political system is supposed to be how in democracies we're supposed to make change, right? Democracy was supposed to be about delivering power to us, the people, that we would be able to shape our common future by taking part in democracy. And this year, as Peter said, was supposed to be the sort of peak year for democracy, billions of us voting. What's actually happening is a system that is wholly inadequate to to manifest the collective wishes of people around the world is being challenged in all sorts of ways. Apathy is one. 19 million of us chose not to vote in the last UK general election. That's many, many more people than actually voted for the Labour Party. And all around the world, in South Africa and India in recent elections, really scarily, young people chose not to vote in record numbers because they don't believe that this system of elections, of politics, of party politics is working for them. Why? It's because we've been led to believe that somehow voting once every few years for political parties that look increasingly similar or increasingly radical in the sort of populist way is the best way of expressing our collective will. When we've known as humans that there are far better ways of doing it. Right? And in some ways, the democracy we have today, the democratic institutions, the systems we have today, are a relic of a 19th century settlement in which elites were brought into our system. How do we have an unelected second chamber in this country, the world's second largest legislative chamber? Only China's People's National Assembly is bigger than our House of Lords. We have 700-odd people. I have lost count because they keep adding more lords. In our legislative chamber, 7% of whom are former party activists, members, or donors. That's not democracy, and I think most people see through that. They say voting once every few years for parties that look increasingly similar, that don't deliver us a genuinely better life, a system that looks corrupt, a system in which people behave out of self-interest, is not sustainable. The Gallup organization has done a poll for decades in this country asking people, do you believe that elected officials act in the best interests of the country? In the 1960s and 70s, huge proportions of us thought that our elected officials did act in the best interests of the country. Last year, that poll showed only 7% of us believe that our elected officials act in the best interests of the country, and nearly 2/3 of us think that they act in their own interest. That's not sustainable. Put all that together, it's not sustainable. But why am I optimistic, or why am I hopeful? It's because the answers to building a far more deliberative democracy in which people feel more meaningfully engaged with political life and decisions, I think lies in our hands. Because we need the creativity to show that new and better ways of making decisions together can happen. And I'm inspired, for example, by civil society organizations that are working through citizens' assemblies, for example, convening groups of people, randomly selected, to talk through tough decisions, whether it's climate change or abortion rights. that there are really amazing examples when we've been able to bypass mainstream political decision-making and come up with more creative solutions. I'm inspired by campaigns. I'm very supportive of the ones that are being run to replace the House of Lords with a House of the People. Why can't we do that? Why couldn't we have a second chamber that actually involves people randomly selected to serve for, say, 2 or 3 year terms, much like we would on jury duty, that would be there to look at the big decisions that politicians find too difficult to make, whether we should be in or out of the EU, whether we should legalize assisted dying. These are the sorts of things where we need the moral authority of people thinking together, working together in a deliberative form. And the people who are leading that sort of thinking, very unpopular and unfashionable in this country for some reason, are civil society activists who are campaigning for a radically better democracy. And so whether it's rewiring our economy to be fundamentally fairer, and whether it's rewiring our politics to give people more a meaningful voice, I think the responsibility lies with us to lead the way and show that another world is possible. But let me conclude by saying the only way that's going to happen, though, I think, and this is drawing on some own lessons over the last 25, 30 years, is that we have to change the way that we work in civil society. Because I am worried that we're losing, in part, because we're not organizing in the right way. That in some ways we've become very reliant on professionalized, organized bits of civil society, the NGOization of social change that many people have noticed in the last few decades, that those organized, professionalized bits of civil society aren't particularly good at working with the rest of civic action, that sometimes those of us who work in NGOs end up instrumentalizing social movements or community partners, that the level playing field between the big NGOs and the small ones is problematic, that the big ones start to crowd others out, take up space and profile and hog resources, that we don't work particularly well across issues. That when, the fight for equal workers' rights, to me, is the same as the fight for social justice, is the same as the fight for racial justice. And if we don't get better at thinking at the intersectional ways in which those struggles are related, then we're lost. And so I think if we're going to have any chance of making change happen, we ourselves need to look at ourselves and the privileges that we hold as individuals, the organizations, if we work for them, and the power and privilege that we might hold, and how we nurture a world, how we be the change we want to see in the world. How do we model the practices of feminist leadership, of true inclusion in the work that we do? And I think if we do all of those sort of things, challenge the systems of economic power, change the way that power works rather than just obsessing with changing the people in power, and change the way that we work, we can make change happen in a really powerful, inspiring way. And I look forward to coming back to Scotland to hear how you guys have done that in the years to come. Let me just close with Charlene again, because if we don't, this is what's going to happen. Well, I know you don't lack the ambition. I can see what you hate. But we're not going to fall into fiction. We're not on some foolish mission. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danny. And almost a session of karaoke there. Almost. We got a sing along. Almost. That's for later. That's after the conference. Delighted to hear all of that, Danny. I think you've hit on the points that we will return to throughout the day in terms of our discussion. I'm really pleased that Ros Foyer, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is the General Secretary of the STUC, is joining us today. Ros has been an active trade unionist throughout her life before she was paid by trade unions to be an active trade unionist. She'd been active in this in worker struggles throughout her life, and I think she brings that incredible depth of experience to her work with the STUC. She was the first woman to be appointed General Secretary of the STUC back in 2020, and I think since that time we've seen the STUC, even more than they have been in the past, mobilised as an important campaigning force in Scotland. You will hear Ros discussing issues not only about the struggles of workers and the important fights that are going on just now, but also about issues around climate change and racial justice. And I know there's an important demo taking place in Glasgow tomorrow on that issue. So, with no more introductions, Ros, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and I really am very excited and grateful for the invitation to come and address you today. I really do think that the anti-poverty movement and the trade union movement need to be working hand in glove if we're going to effectively tackle poverty and rebalance wealth in our society. We can be powerful, powerful allies in that struggle. And I'm really delighted also to follow Danny's excellent contribution, because I share the view that democratising our economies and investing in real activism is crucial if we're going to make change happen. And I want to start by just sharing my thoughts about trade unions. Ignore the screen behind me, I'm pressing the buttons by mistake, so just ignore that. Sorry. So I want to start by just talking a bit about some of our experiences in making change happen. And I'm not here to tell you that we've got all the answers, far from it. We are on a journey of learning and rebuilding and organising ourselves. But I do want to highlight some key steps that I think all of us need to consider if we're serious about real, deep, transformational change in our society. And the first thing I want to say to you is that we've been busy in the last few years as a movement here in Scotland. We've seen over the last 2 years just over 1,000 different industrial actions and strike actions taking place with groups of workers across Scotland. And that's involved more than 360,000 workers who've stood up and taken action and joined together and collectivised. And that's workers in schools, colleges, universities, our councils, our railways, our buses, our post offices, across whole big swathes of the private sector and across parts of the voluntary sector, who've all taken a very difficult decision, because often these are very low-paid workers who are living in poverty, but they've taken a decision that enough is enough to take action, and it's either to get a decent pay rise on the table, but sometimes it's about getting cuts to their services taken off the table. And the fact remains that taking that strike action largely works. It has delivered incredible results. Our research shows that through collective bargaining, workers in Scotland have won more than £4.5 billion, but more than £3 billion of that wouldn't have been put on the table if it hadn't been for those workers coming together and taking that industrial action. It was money that the bosses and the politicians claimed wasn't there until the workers stood up and fought for it. So that money wouldn't have been in the hands of the working class if those workers hadn't fought back and acted collectively and been active. And because of that, our union showed last year a net growth of 30,000 workers joining trade unions across Scotland, which is one of the most significant rises in trade union membership that we've seen in recent years. And I think if the past 40 years has taught us anything, it's that justice is not achieved by asking nicely or by lobbying or just being in the room. It is through agitation. And we've taken that agitation into the political arena because we're fed up with being in the room. The Scottish Government in particular has been very good at having us in the room, but that doesn't make real change happen. And we need our politicians to know that we're going to keep causing trouble, frankly, if they don't deliver real change for us. That's our job, as far as I'm concerned. So the trade union movement and the anti-poverty movement are united by common values, by often common demands. And we're also united, I think, in our view that we need to have a government at every level that's committed to rebuilding our social security, rebuilding our infrastructure, our housing and our public services. And Labour's UK budget, it was a start. It was a bit of a turning point in terms of direction, but it was a start from a very low bar. And we saw borrowing rules redressed. We saw £40 billion of tax rises, about £70 billion of new investment going into our economy. But it could have gone so much further. It could have gone further in areas like corporation tax, wealth tax, capital gains tax. And that could have raised revenues that would easily have covered winter fuel allowance for our pensioners. It could easily have lifted the two-child benefit cap and a whole host of other things that we know need to happen. And at a Scottish level, we need to see our politicians being bolder too. The truth is that taxes are just going to have to rise for the rich, and we're going to have to tax wealth, because if we want Scandinavian levels of public services, we can't have that on American levels of taxation, and that's what we've got at the moment. So it's us that need to make those arguments. In my experience, politicians don't lead, they follow the public narrative and they follow the public opinion. So, you know, it's up to us to do that. But let's not forget we've made progress. I've got no doubt that the Scottish Government wouldn't have introduced a new tax rate last year for those who earn over $75,000 in Scotland if it hadn't been for organisations like the STUC and a whole range of others who are sitting in this room calling for that, pushing for that and making those arguments in the public narrative and opening up the doors on a grown-up debate about taxation. But we also need to be clear about what's at stake, because if we don't make that progress faster and stronger and more meaningful and more immediate for people on the ground, then it's going to get really, really difficult. For me, the centre-left politicians across our aisles are really in the last chance saloon of public opinion. If they let the people down again, then I think people are going to start looking to the far right for answers. And that is a danger that I think is growing greater every single day. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that they have a very simple, they're very, very sophisticated. They have a very effective and simple story to tell. And I'm going to tell it briefly, so forgive me, because I want to illustrate this point. So the reason that your living standards are worse, that your public services don't work, that your town is run down is because your out-of-touch politicians have let the migrants come and steal your jobs and your benefits while being fixated with woke issues like climate change and identity politics. Now, we know that this story is utterly false and it belongs in a moral cesspit, but it is a very compelling story. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. It identifies the problems, it identifies who the baddies and the villains of the piece are, and it also importantly has a grain of truth. Living standards are falling, public services don't work, politicians are out of touch. And there's another story, though, that we need to tell and that needs to be told, and it's also connected with the material conditions of the working class, and it identifies the real villains of the piece. But we've all got to get a lot better at telling that story on the ground and in our communities. And that's the story of the boss that exploits their workers because they know they can get away with it because of weak employment rights. That's the landlord that hikes up the rents in a mouldy flat because they can. That's the energy companies that make record profits on us during a cost-of-living crisis. That's the big private care homes that hide their profits in the Cayman Islands. It's the rolling stock train companies that extract ever more profits from our railways and they fail to invest in new stock. It's the billionaire owner of Manchester United Football Club that wants to replace our last oil refinery in Scotland with an import-export terminal just because it's more profitable, instead of our government investing in green fuel refinery for the future. It's the hedge funds, it's the city bankers that destabilise our economy and distort our markets and distort our politics and our budgets. And I could go on and on and on for hours about all of these things, but I think my key point is that it's our job not to defend the way things are, not to say sometimes, you know, everything's getting better. It's actually our job to educate, agitate and organise, and to harness that anger that people quite rightly feel in their communities and make sure that we're directing it where we should go. And that is up at the rich and the powerful and the decision makers, not down at the most vulnerable in our communities. So we do need to get better at telling those stories. We need to pick up a page or two out of the playbook of the other side. And it's not just clever framing, that is important, but it's also about ensuring that the issues we talk about are rooted in the material concerns of the people that we represent and that we work with. It's listening to people's voices and what those concerns are. It's making sure those voices are escalated into the leadership of our organisations, and it's ensuring that people that have got real life experience operate at all levels within our movements and lead our movements. And, you know, if we look at some of the great working class revolutionaries and reformers in Scottish society, John Maclean, Mary Barber, John Wheatley, Jenny Lee, Mick McGahey, Jimmy Reid, these people could tell compelling stories because they'd lived it, and they could identify solutions in real drivers because they knew the issues that were affecting the working class, and they benefited very much from self-education of the working class. There was a level of political education that they benefited from, and I would say we need to get back to that, educating people, like really, you know, not college education degrees, I mean like community education and working with people, and that's something we're looking at through the trade union movement at the moment, because if we don't plant those seeds of working class education, if we don't nourish and grow our movements, then we're not going to be able to build the power and build the demands in the way that we need to, that are going to be effective and are going to shift the public narrative the way that we need to. And we've got no shortage of demands, but the task ahead is to work together. We need to connect up all of our demands into a huge, big, angry movement that demands change and demands it now. And that's going to take deep organising. It's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of effort. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by magic. It happens through conversations and hard work and people being passionate and caring and working with each other and putting the effort in. And they need to see hope, and they need to see the small wins getting won, to know that they're capable of making the big wins happen. So, you know, that sustained and escalating pressure can make a difference to what our politicians choose to do and choose not to do, but we need to build that anger and build that pressure. And it's no easy task, but little worth doing ever is. But the one thing that I do know and that I have seen throughout my working life is that when the working class unites and fights back, we do make real change happen. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rose. That was brilliant, as I expected, and you've also given us the name for our next conference, which is Keep Causing Trouble, I think, from making change happen to keeping causing trouble. But I think Rose, again, has hit on the points that we absolutely need to focus on throughout our discussions today, and that will be picked up throughout the, through the workshops, about how we actually come together, about what the strategies are that we put together to make change happen. Our final speaker on the panel here is Laura Young, who again will undoubtedly be familiar to many of you. Laura is a climate activist, an environmental scientist, an ethical influencer, and I have to say, influencer of the year 2024 in Scotland. Some of you who know what influencer, yep. Some of you who understand better what influencers are can explain that to me later, but congratulations, Laura. I think she's been prominent not only in the work that she's done internationally now. I heard her most recently reporting back from the COP conference in Baku, but also the really important campaigning work she did around disposable vapes, I think, which is also really well known. She's also well known in my house because she's featured in a book called Spectacular Women, Spectacular Scottish Women, which my daughter pulls off the shelf at every opportunity and shows me, so well done on achieving that as well. She's going to talk to us today about what we can learn from campaigns for climate justice. I think, as Danny and Roz have mentioned, there are connections here, and we need to make those connections more immediate and more alive. So Laura's going to talk to us a bit about that, and how we can also, I think, really importantly, engage younger people. Again, as Danny said, that disenchantment with politics is a real challenge. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much. And if I had the choice, I would have gone first because I don't really know how to follow that. But yeah, it's so wonderful to be here and see some familiar faces and also see new people, because I think part of what is great about this is bringing people together. And yeah, I do lots of different work. And I am still on Twitter. I'm also on TikTok. Do you know what that is, Peter? Yeah, it's part of being an influencer. No, but it's great. And I was asked to come here to answer 4 questions in a short reflection. So I thought I would pose you the questions and then I'll give you my answers. The first one was, what sustains people in the campaign for climate justice? And I think there's 2 simple answers to this. One is the science. We know what's happening and we know the stories and the statistics. So that drives you. Part of my day job is I'm doing a PhD, right? I'm in the thick of it when it comes to it. So we are driven by science, statistics and stories. We are knowing what is happening. But what also drives and sustains us is that we know the solutions exist. We know what the solutions are to climate change. We know how we need to reduce our emissions. We know what we need to do to be more sustainable. We just need to get a move on. And that really is what drives us in that. And then the second question I was posed was, well, what lessons can be applied from climate, environmental campaigning, and how do we apply that to tackling poverty? And I've been part of lots of different campaigns, and I see lots of colleagues in the rooms where there's been coalitions of organisations campaigning. But we've also done campaigning on things like the disposable vapes. You've probably seen me moan about that for long enough. But there's a few lessons that I think I've certainly been able to pull out of that. The first is that with all of our campaigning, we need to be as creative as possible. We need to showcase the problem in visible ways, and we need to use as many outlets as possible. And yes, that means TikTok, so you need to get on there. But we need to be able to do it in a way that helps people understand the problems. So sometimes when I'm talking about climate change or waste, it can be a little bit too big and a little bit too abstract. And so it's important for us to find the really specific things that will help. So with disposable vapes, we've ran a campaign now for almost 2 years, and we've got great success. They're getting banned next year, hopefully. But actually with that, a lot of my colleagues would say, why on earth are you spending so much time campaigning about this tiny little thing when there are so many bigger problems in the world? And I get it. I totally get it. But actually, disposable vapes was something tangible. It was something real. It was so understandable. People knew what they were. They'd seen them as litter. They'd heard stories about, or even maybe had a young person in their family who was taking it up at school, whatever it might be. So it was very, very understandable. And it galvanised a whole group of people to get on board. But also it was a gateway to talking about a much bigger issue. Well, actually 2. The first was this idea of disposable technology and just sheer horrible amounts of waste associated with throwaway technology, single-use plastic, and just a waste of resources. But it also opened up a conversation of this constant evolution of the tobacco and nicotine vaping industries. And so even though, yes, it was a very niche, tiny little topic, it actually gave us a way to crack open a whole world of conversations. And so, yes, we're going to get a great piece of legislation across the UK to deal with that, but actually we're able to do something a lot bigger. And that was a fantastic thing. But I think one of the most important lessons I learned was that we need to be collaborative. And so this campaign, it was a bit of guerrilla campaigning. It sort of started at the end of 2022 with some tweets and raging Zoom calls with colleagues and people that were interested. And slowly we started to build momentum. What was a few conversations on WhatsApp turned into a bit more formal Zoom calls, which then started almost like an unofficial coalition. But the one thing that I would say is crucial is that we never closed the door. We were always open for more organisations to come in. And initially it did start as a purely environmental thing. It was litter picking groups, it was Keep Scotland Beautiful, it was the Marine Conservation Society. But slowly we managed to snowball and bring in many different organisations. We had people across public health, we had Ash Scotland, we had youth workers, we had schools, parents, teachers, we even had car garages because they popped tyres and they were getting a bit annoyed about that. But the point there was that it just kept evolving and kept growing, and we never closed the door to new people coming in. And I don't think we would have got where we got to if we'd said, actually, sorry, this is just about the litter. We're not really worried about the youth impact or the health impact. We kept saying, open the door, keep having more people in. And so that really excites me about what we're all trying to do, because actually we all can collaborate more, and that was just a huge lesson. And actually, to Roz's point as well, often as a climate person, I get pitted against people. Oh, how could you possibly want to stand next to anyone from Grangemouth? Don't let that happen. Actually, that's where the collaboration is strongest, when you say, you can't pit us against each other because we're working together. We know each other. And I think that's important to make sure that that can't happen. The third question I was asked was, how can we better link tackling poverty and the climate crisis to get this just transition? I will say, I think there's terms that have been lost. They've been lost to polarisation. They've been, net zero, just transition. Sometimes when you say these words can set you off in the wrong direction. But I think it's important to actually tell the story of what that looks like. And certainly for me, I know that that's something that the environmental movement has not been good at. Often when you think about climate change, you maybe think of a tiny little iceberg with a little skinny polar bear on it, and that's kind of what you think about climate change. You think about it, something happening really far away to a polar bear that's starving. And that is something that we need to be concerned about. But actually, we need to widen our messaging and actually talk about what climate change and climate justice looks like. And I think that's important. And Roz talked about mouldy flats. And some of the research I've been doing as part of my PhD has been thinking about people and accommodation. And it's just shocking the amount of people that have that story. And as a climate activist, yes, I would like people to get insulation and double glazing to be saving carbon emissions. But I would also like it so that they have dignity in their house, so that they feel comfortable inviting their pals over to have a cup of tea, so that they aren't worried about the health impacts of breathing that in. It's not just about these carbon emissions that are floating around. It's about so much more than that. And there's a story I always share, because part of the work that I love to do is to go out and speak to amazing community groups who are doing all sorts of different projects. And Climate Action Straven is one of my favourites. And if you get the chance to go to Straven, go and meet them. Meet Alison in particular. She's fab. And that is, Straven's maybe got about 7,000 people. And it's one of these kind of fringe little villages, and it's beautiful. And they started a climate action group. And at first they said, well, I wonder what our community would like. Probably thinking they would say something like flower beds next to the high street. But actually the community said, we'd really like a bus into Glasgow, because Straven is this village that's very close to Glasgow, but was traditionally cut off. So if you wanted to go to Glasgow, you had to have a car to go maybe to East Kilbride or to Hamilton to then get a further bus or a train in. So it was a bit of a faff. And so the people of Straven were completely cut off to Glasgow unless you had a car and you were able to make this journey or get a taxi or whatever it might be. And so Climate Action Straven set out on this journey to get a bus. Now, first of all, they went to the bus companies and they said, go and just give us a bus route, that'd be really handy. And the bus company said, no, I don't think it'll be a profitable route, we don't see any value in it. So Climate Action Straven, long story short, are now Scotland's smallest bus operator. They have one bus route called the 3C. It runs from Straven into Glasgow, just next to Queen Street. And over the years, they started with one bus and a couple of drivers. And because of their financial model, meaning they can't make profit, they now have 3 buses and 8 bus drivers, and they run these services into Glasgow. And I think the last statistic I heard, which will already be out of date, is that even within the first sort of year of operation, they saved 100,000 trips into Glasgow. Now, as a climate activist, I'm like, isn't that great about all of those carbon emissions? But actually, one of the things that was most powerful is I was just down there a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying it's not just about the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint of climate action Straven. They said, this is why we do this. A mum had come in with tears in her eyes to the little hub, and she said, I just want to say thank you for all you've done to get this bus service. Because my daughter got a place at university in Glasgow. There was no way we were going to be able to afford her to get a flat in Glasgow. We don't have enough money to get her driving lessons, to get a car so that she could have got into Glasgow. And if it wasn't for her being under 22 and having the bus pass, and this bus being on our doorstep, she would never have been able to accept that position at that university and go and further her education. And that's just one story, right, that they've heard. But actually, that bus is so much more than just carbon emissions being saved. It's unlocking employment opportunities, educational opportunities, even just social conditions and opportunities for the people of Straven to get in and out of Glasgow. So if you want a good day out, go to Straven, get the bus. They also do a hot air balloon festival, which I did not know, so you can all get the bus to that next year. So expand the way we talk about things, and that's a lesson I've had to take on myself as well. Don't just talk about carbon emissions. And I've probably already talked a little bit too long, so I'll maybe go to the last question, which was, how can the anti-poverty movement better engage young people in our campaigning? Right, I'm pushing young, but my second name's Young, so forever young. But I think it's a really good question, because actually young people, I'm going by the karaoke theme, young people, they bring so much energy into our movements. And when I was in Straven, actually, I was giving talks at all the schools. It was exhausting, but I was giving all the talks at the schools about vapes. I'm dining out on the vape campaign for a bit longer, and I was talking about vapes. And this wee boy, he was in P7, he just stuck up his hand. I mean, P7s haven't gone to high school yet, so they still have all the questions in the world. They've not been conditioned to keep it in. And so after the talk, there was all these questions, and I was talking about, you know, tobacco and vapes and the health and the environment, and I was trying to do it in a way that they could understand to, you know, kind of help set in their ways, you know, what to do. And this wee boy just shot up his hand and he said, so you've told us all these bad things about cigarettes and vapes, and I'm just wondering, why are these companies even allowed to exist? And I was like, oh gosh, right, how do you explain? And the teacher's looking at me going, go on, I want to see how you answer that. But actually, young people help us because they just ask the questions that we are too scared to ask, or we've been in the systems too long. So bring in the voices, hold space for their questions, their lived experience. And sometimes that needs to look in a formal way. You know, can your organisation set up something that can bring in young people to hear their voices, support them, train them, maybe support them financially if you're taking a lot of their time, but think about how you can incorporate young people. And there's a million ways of doing it. So you can come and speak to me and say, what would that actually look like in practice? But even things like engage with our youth parliament as a first set of principles. So there you go. Because I think there's so much value in young people, and I think we need more young people even here. You know, even like today, what could we do to get more people in the room that don't quite understand Danny's Texas reference? I know I didn't, but But I think that's something we can ask ourselves is, you know, every room we're in, I know we need to do more than just getting them in the room, but, you know, how can we have some young people filling up these seats? Is it engaging with the high schools? Is it engaging with the youth parliament? Is it youth organisations? What is it? So that we can give away some of that power. So that was a few of my reflections on those 4 questions, but really looking forward to the conversation we have next. Thank you.
So the promised karaoke is still in the air. It might happen by the end of the day. We'll see. Thank you very much for that, Laura. I think, again, our last speaker there, tying together all the themes that we've heard throughout the morning so far. We've now got some time for questions. We've got maybe about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So we've got a couple of roving mics. I think there's one over there and there's one right here. We probably need to move over that way a wee bit. So could I see some hands? Because there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of questions that have been raised for me from our 3 contributions so far. So there must be questions from you. Oh, I can see one right in the middle. Can I see maybe a couple of hands up and then we can start going around? But Polly, if you just say who you are first and where you're from, if you're from an organisation, that'd be great.
I'm Polly Jones, I'm from Trussell. So as a trade unionist and working for a big NGO, I'm really interested in what you've all been talking about this morning. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about what this looks like. What does this look like in practice now, where different coalitions and organisations are coming together to work on common issues? What could it look like? And if you want to do it in karaoke style, that would be fantastic.
You kind of only have yourself to blame for that. And we'll maybe take a couple of questions and then come back to the panel just so as we can fit a few in. I can see Jamie over here and then Innocent over here.
Thanks very much. Great contributions. I just wanted to touch on a big trend. It's not a new trend, but it's a big one of late, which is that we're seeing a real organisation of vested interests fighting back against many of our campaigns. Ahead of the Scottish budget next week, we're seeing no shortage of pushback in terms of tax divergence in Scotland or the like. And while we can't outspend those organisations, I certainly think we need to outthink them, but would be really interested to get your thoughts on how we counter that quite organised counter-campaigns that we're seeing across, whether it be climate action or tax justice, for example. Thanks.
And finally, Innocent.
Well, my question really is much more related to what extent does climate change help tackle or mitigate poverty in a very practical sense, other than theorizing? Thank you.
So three big questions, and I'm going to just go along the table. That maybe seems the easiest and fairest way. So Ros, will I start with you, if you'd like to come to any of those questions?
Okay, thanks. So I'm not going to do this in karaoke, by the way. Although my karaoke number would be four non-blondes revolution, I think. So, a couple of practical examples of working together. Yesterday I was on a demo and lobby at the Scottish Parliament with workers from Grangemouth, and they and their union Unite have a plan that requires investment from both the UK and the Scottish Government to use the existing workforce and the existing machinery they have in their plant to start to produce biofuels, which the airline industry is going to be crying out for. There's going to be a 3,000-fold expansion in the need for this fuel. We could become a world leader, but it requires significant investment, and it requires them upsetting a billionaire by taking his company off him effectively. So not insurmountable things that we're asking them to do. But there was a green bloc in the march. So we had the workers from Grangemouth who work in an oil refinery marching side by side with young people from Friends of the Earth and other organisations in that green bloc. And at the end of the day, their plan was about coming up with a green transition, but one which protected the local community, protected the workforce, and is also going to be good for our economy in real hard terms, but also good for our planet. So to me, that's a really practical example of some of the conversations, and you could see that starting when COP took place in Scotland. Another example is our trades councils. We've been putting a lot of work into trying to rebuild our trades council network. And trades councils are like local little sort of versions of the STUC. All the local union branches can join the trades council. And in honesty, they've been dying over the last 40 years. They tend to have a couple of 80-year-olds and their dog in them, and a few members of the Communist Party. Not that there's anything wrong with the Communist Party, but they're not vibrant, alive, they're not representative of their community, and they're not really connected to their community in a lot of cases. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is actually, I've seen some great examples at Clydebank and Paisley, who were out campaigning in Erskine when the far right were targeting migrant workers at the hotel in Erskine. Up in Moray, we had a similar situation where a lot of young people joined the Trades Council and started campaigning there. We've seen it down in Dumfries and Galloway now, where they've built up some really active links to local community groups and organisations. And it's a start. It's really good to see the young people pouring into these trades councils. They're using them for local community campaigns. They're taking campaigns to their local authorities now about budgets. Glasgow Trades Council do loads of work with environmental groups about their free buses campaign, for example. So there's a lot of good stuff happening out there, but I would love to see more linkage there. And I think on the other things, for me, how do we sort of counter the messages that are coming? Because the business lobby are very sophisticated. You know, we've got sort of a really strong lobby and people that like to keep our governments in line. I think you do have to get out there and shift the public narrative. So the STUC spent many years very busily and very earnestly lobbying government and going to lots of meetings with government and doing lots of things. And I suspect sometimes Civic Scotland does that. We all got sucked in a bit to all these meetings with government ministers, and wasn't it great that they wanted to talk to us all? But what has that really achieved? You know, has the gap between the rich and the poor got less? Have we managed to tackle in-work poverty? Have poverty figures changed significantly for all the talk? Not enough. So, you know, we are doing a lot of work now to try and make sure that we actually are out there. And there's no point in us meeting a minister or making all the arguments inside the corridors of power if we're not out there engaging with the media, whether it be social media or the mainstream media, actually trying to shift public opinion and bring the debate out into the open. And apart from anything else, just to let people know, trade unions still exist. We're still in there fighting the good fight. And this is what we think about stuff, and this is why. So, you know, I think we all need to get a bit more public and a bit more out there with our arguments and with our campaigns, and we can all do that, whether it's in local newspapers or on you know, whatever social media platforms it is, and influencing and everything else. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Danny.
Yeah, I've got two songs, one by Air Supply and the other is Think by Aretha Franklin. So no, I'm not going to sing, but I do want to talk about Air Supply in answer to the third and the first question, which is so I'm a trustee at the Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation, which is an urban health foundation in Lambeth and Southwark in South London. You know, really urban, highly unequal boroughs of London. And over the last few years, we've been doing some work on air quality, which in some ways is a classic, this is Laura's point, but my version of Laura's story, which is a classic air quality sort of climate change sort of topic, but it's also inherently about poverty. Because all the research that we and others did showed that the people who were suffering from poor air quality most were the poorest bits of those communities, because they were most exposed, they had the worst sort of insulation, a whole range of factors. Huge cost to them in terms of their lived experience, their life expectancy, huge cost to society because of the costs of treating those people who, of all the symptoms that they were getting, and of course huge cost to society because of the costs of poverty to the economy. Right? These are people who are not then able to fulfil their full potential. And what came together to take action in that borough and in London on air quality, I think, was exactly as Laura described it. This really fabulous coalition of people and actors who ranged from climate activists who are angry about fossil fuels, fossil fuel cars and trucks driving through an urban centre like London, groups of citizens who had organised, with the help of Citizens UK and others, to come together around this, minoritised ethnic communities who were angry about what was happening in their communities, who were also getting informed, the hospital itself, talking about the costs of poor air quality to healthcare and the pressures it's placing on an already stretched budget, and of course independent civil society institutions, including foundations like ours. And by coming together, a whole bunch of things happened. Everything from the Mayor of London's low emission zone that you would have seen and read about, controversial but hugely important in reducing fossil fuel cars and vehicles, all the way to we worked with, to talk about your tyre example, once the sort of fossil fuel emissions and carbon dioxide was dropping, the next big issue was other particles, some of which were being created by the treads of tyres from trucks, livery trucks. And so we worked with the biggest fleet operators in that part of London to change the tyres that their trucks were using to reduce particulate emissions. So it's having that, if we wouldn't have had that level of success or that sophistication of approach without that coalition of unusual suspects. And then just on think, very briefly on Jamie's point around how, in some ways, those people who want to dismantle the things that we all stand for, many of us stand for, have outthought us. I think it's exactly right. If I think back to the founding of the New Economics Foundation, the worry then was that there was this sort of ideology that was the state is bad, markets are good, we have to dismantle everything about the state and set markets free. Simple set of ideas that if you look really far back, in the 1960s and 70s, right-wing philanthropists in America, starting with economics faculties, starting with journals, starting with newspapers, started to imbue public thinking, our thinking, state is bad, market is good. And they have outthought us. And I think the challenge back to us is, what's our response? What's our intergenerational approach? If we're thinking in 40 years' time, what do we want society to think? And I hope it's about, if we're going to claim to be a civilized species, we have to look after each other. To look after each other, we need meaningful social protection, which means we need a functioning and effective state, which means we need to have a tax base or a resource base that provides that. And, it's that sort of ideological battle that we need to fight, and we need to fight it now, but with the long term in mind.
Thank you, Danny. Laura.
Just say one quick thing so we could get to more questions, hopefully. But I think just on the last one, actually, I think it's it's clear how climate change impacts people, and particularly people in poverty, whether it's who's impacted by flooding or has the resilience to build back from that, or damp and mould or air pollution. And that's globally, but also here in Scotland. But the question I want to ask, and this is also a request in terms of collaboration, is can you all also help us make sure that climate policies don't make poverty worse as well? Because I think there's a real risk that we put things in place to help the environment that actually have a knock-on effect to people. And as a climate person, we need your expertise to make sure that happens. So we'd love to work together on that.
Thank you very much. Excellent answers. And again, I think many of those points that have been raised, we didn't plan this, but are coming up in the workshops that will follow about how we get into some of those issues. I think Rose's point about that balance between working inside government or working with government and working outside and holding them account is really important for us. And I think we have reached perhaps some of the limits, testing the limits of how far we can go with that sitting inside with government, and we need to flex the muscle of outside again. Time for a couple of more questions. So one here and then one right at the back. So, and because I saw your hand go up really quickly, I'll take one more here.
Thank you. Joe McCready from Care Scotland. I've got two direct questions, if that's at all possible. Danny, a question for you, and I don't want you to spoil your book, but I was just wondering if you're in your work, if you've seen any good examples of power being put to disabled people and their carers. We see a lot that they're disenfranchised from participating in politics. I'm just wondering if there's any good examples of that. And a question to Roz, you spoke a lot about participation, about working with the third sector. I think with the National Care Service, I understand it's not a perfect bill, there's a lot of issues with it, but there's some things in there that are really vital for carers and for unpaid care, where it's a right for a break, Anne's Law and stuff like that. So I think it would be good to see you continuing to ask for that as well as asking for the other things that you're asking for. So that's just a separate point maybe rather than a question. Thank you.
And then at the back. Yep, go for it, please.
Hi, it's Erica from Citizens Advice Scotland. My question is, how do we use social media to tell our story and send out our message? I think we've all seen the incredible power of this new form of media and the way in which it feeds on legacy media but at the same time shatters it. So how do we use it to our advantage?
Okay, and I think there was another question here, Chloe, just at the table right in the middle. And then we're going to squeeze in another quick question, and I think, Davey, you might have something from folks online as well, yeah? Okay, so once we get this question, we'll go over here, and then you've got like 30 seconds each to answer all these complicated questions.
Hi folks, John McCafferty from Scottish Communities for Health and Wellbeing. I'm channeling my inner primary 7. Why?
Oh no, don't.
Why doesn't our government work for us?
And there's a question for the rest of the
I think we've run out of time, actually. It's,
Well done, Laura. So we've got one final...
Hi, I'm Riddy from Oxfam. My question is also probably too big. And you all talked about organising in very different ways, but you all talked about coalitions and working together. But how do we stop coalitions becoming too unwieldy and too big? Because obviously, Laura, you talked about bringing lots of people in. So how do we do that effectively with lots of voices in the room?
Brilliant questions. And one final one here, Chloe, just from online, from Davey.
Hi folks, I'm David Eyre, the Communications Officer at the Poverty Alliance. But this is a question or a comment really from Catherine Hughes from the live chat and the live stream. Just maybe picking up on that point about maybe asking what do we think about the idea of a formal campaign network here in Scotland to develop connections and assist others to help empower a community of individuals and the skills they need to be more effective to make change.
Thanks, Davey. So there's a lot there. There's an awful lot there. We've got, I'm going to say 10 minutes. Have we got 10 minutes, Ruth? Is that okay? And people can still have a very quick coffee? Maybe 8 minutes, right? Okay. Okay. So the clock's ticking. Laura, we'll start with you this time.
Sure, and I'll just maybe answer the ones that I think are most relevant to me. So in terms of social media to tell stories, I'll give you a fun fact, which is TikTok. I know I go on about it, but people do think it's like a silly little app for dancing. For the last 3 years in a row, TikTok has overtaken Google as a search engine. It's where people are going to Google, well, TikTok, how to boil an egg. Also, what's a trade union? What is...
Texas.
Texas. That'll be me.
Charlene's on TikTok.
Yeah, so I'll follow it. But I think we need to take seriously that people are not sitting waiting for the 6 o'clock news or getting the morning paper, and that's where they get all their information. So we do need to be embracing these spaces. And I think my advice would be find an authentic way of telling your stories, find a creative way that works for you or your organisation or your community, and it will look different. Try it out, find a way. And I think just use as authentic voices as possible. I think any organisation that's got anything remotely corporate is just not interesting anymore, and people don't want to follow it. So just really try and lean into that. And particularly on the disposable vapes campaign, I would go out and litter pick vapes and film it and do a chatty video and talk about it. And it created a buzz on its own. And then I had BBC News, Sky News, STV wanting to come and interview me because they'd seen it. And so don't always think you need to wait for the media to be interested or the politicians. Go and make the interest, for yourself. And I think in terms of coalition management, I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, but in terms of the vapes, again, we made this amazing coalition and invited lots of people in. And once it had served its purpose, it stopped. Like, we didn't need to keep meeting. We didn't need to keep going on about it. And we all meet in other spaces. So don't be afraid to close down a coalition once you feel you've addressed a problem, or move it on to something else or change it and adapt it. I used to work, for a big charity, and I think we were in lots of coalitions, and sometimes I was like, I'm not really sure what I'm doing here, but I'm here on my staff time, so just think about that. And why doesn't our government work for us? I don't know, but I think I want to address the young people and politics from the beginning, because I don't think we've got good people going into it. We do have good people going into it, but we don't have enough, particularly young people going into it, from council level all the way up. So I want to try and address that first.
Thanks a lot.
To Joe, so in the book I do talk a bit about examples like the Equal Care Cooperative, which tries to address the issue about pay and conditions for care workers, about adequate provision, but importantly it's about voice. Like, how do we create structures, whether it's a cooperative or a consultative body, that dignify the people who we're working with? And so that's the sort of example for me that is inspiring, because it's actually doing things. It's building a cooperative that gets stuff done with inclusion hardwired into it. On social media, I think maybe a different angle is we're not going to get the public space, the digital public spaces we deserve, unless we re-regulate these spaces better. Like, how come the public space that, the agora in which life is supposed to happen is now digitized to a large extent, but it's highly privatized, and worse still, we are the commodities. So we're thinking we're participating in democratic life, but we're being monetized so that Elon Musk gets even richer. That's crazy. But what's crazier is we can avoid that, because all we need is some states to get together and regulate these spaces, or better still, make them mutualized or non-profit. And it's possible. Look at spaces like Wikipedia, which is run by a non-profit foundation. So we can have highly successful digital initiatives that have these sorts of spaces that then at least don't have algorithms that make the whole thing much worse and almost impossible to have a meaningful discussion. On the state, ultimately, what the state needs to do is discipline capital. Like your man Adam Smith said that a while ago, right? We've forgotten that. And I think the state won't work unless we discipline the state to discipline capital. And we're paying the price for 40 years of the state failing to discipline capital. That's my take on it as an economist. And then finally on the campaigns, there's an African proverb that you've probably heard a lot, which is, if you want to walk fast, go alone. If you want to walk far, go together. And I think that's for me, sometimes we've got to move quickly, and sometimes that probably means just going it alone, because you've just got to, a small group of people have to make the decision really quickly and take a risk. But if you really want impact, then you need to work in coalition and go together. But we just need to be clear about when which strategy works, because sometimes we want to go fast and then we create a coalition and we go nowhere. So there you go.
Rose, final word.
Thanks, Peter. Well, what I would say is completely agree with that idea that agility is sometimes the enemy of breadth, and there's always a tension there, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Campaigning, policy can be messy at times. It's never perfect, but there are times when you really need broad coalitions to make real change happen. National Care Service Bill, I appreciate what the colleague said there. There was lots of good things about it, but there was more bad that outweighed the good for us to be able to support it. It wasn't worth spending the amount of money that was going to get spent on it. But I'm happy to have the debate with you offline about that. The social media stuff, we need to get a lot better at it. I know that for sure, because capital is very, very good at using it to their ends, and profitising it and commercialising it, and it can be a force for massive good as well. And that brings me to, why don't our governments work for us? Well, they don't work for us because they work for the rich and the powerful, and they work too much for capital, and that's because when you've got money talks, money equals a lot of power. But I think what we always have to remember is there is no power greater than people power, and we are more powerful than we can dare to imagine. I think it was Nelson Mandela said that. And sometimes we just have to lose our fear of exercising the real power that we have when we come together. And it's not pretty, but it can make a big difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rose. I think there's a lot of lessons for us to take and to consider over the next few hours as we're discussing together. But the key one for me there, out of what everyone was saying, is that we need to be better organised. We all absolutely need to be better organised across civil society, whether that's in the trade unions, where it's the third sector, where it's faith bodies. We need to be working together better. So hopefully throughout the day, some of what we'll end up with at the end of the day is how we do that. I was struck, Danny talked about this long-term vision. There's something called the Powell Memorandum in the 70s, I think, before Reagan was elected, possibly even before that, that set out this is where the right wants to go, this is where capital, this is where big money wants to go. And largely, it's been implemented. That was a long-term 50-year horizon around the Powell Memorandum, and it really influenced the direction. We see the same thing happening perhaps in the States at the moment with Project 25, but I think we need to be thinking at that kind of scale, like if the kinds of change that we want to to see happen aren't going to happen in 6 months. They aren't going to happen in a year. We need to be working for them long term. So hopefully what we've had this morning, I think what we've had is some of the elements of how we start to make that change. And we're going to continue that discussion in our workshops, which are just coming up, which, as you can see, will touch on all of those issues that we've discussed this morning. So building from the grassroots up, how we hold that space of policy, what does coalitions look like, and digital, how do we use digital? So we're going to go into these questions in more depth. It's on your badges, on your lanyards, about which room you'll be in this morning, so hopefully you can follow the directions to the Carrick, Kilsyth, Tinto and Harris suites. You've got probably, I think, 9 minutes, Ruth, you keep me to the minute for these, for a quick coffee, so grab a quick coffee or a cup of tea or some water and move on and keep the discussion going. But before you do that, thank you to all of our speakers this morning, Laura, Danny and Royce. Thank you very much. We're going to end with, I think, an equally fantastic end to the day. I know from being in a lot of the workshops this morning and this afternoon, we've had some really important and critical discussions, self-critical discussions about how we campaign, how we make change. We want to finish the conference today with an opportunity to reflect on some of those discussions and to consider what some of the next steps might be for all of us, whether as individual activists, whether as community or voluntary organisations. How do we actually put into practice some of what we've heard today? What do we learn from today? How do we change things in the future? So we've talked about how we influence policy, how we build coalitions, about the role of grassroots community organising, as well as some of the critical themes that we have to consider around adequate incomes, housing, just transition, taxation. We've covered a lot. And so I think now what we want to do is, what do we do with this? What do we learn from this? And how do we take this forward in a way that I think is hopeful and positive? Because we've also had discussions that are clear-eyed about the scale of the challenge that we face. So we want to inject, or maintain actually, that feeling of hope that I think was there in the opening session, and consider how we can develop our anti-poverty movement in Scotland in the future and meet the big challenges that we face. So we've got another fantastic panel to finish the afternoon. The way that we're going to do this session is we're going to hear from Jonathan Cox, who is Deputy Director of Citizens UK, Claire Telfer, who is Head of Scotland for Save the Children, and Amal Azzedine, who is down here as a freelance activist, but I think that sounds like that diminishes what you've done. You may know Amal from being one of the Glasgow girls from 20 years ago now, we discovered earlier, who was involved in campaigning in Glasgow 20 years ago, which you may say a bit more about. And we'll hear some reflections from them on what inspires them or their organisation to make change, and to think about that. And then from there, we'll go back to tables. We'll go back to you to think about what inspires you, what gives you hope, what your organisation wants to do following this conference to make change, or what you will do, and what support or what role the Poverty Alliance as the anti-poverty network in Scotland can play in providing some of that support. And then we'll come back to hear a bit from you and have a little final roundup from our panel. So, with that said, Jonathan, over to you. Jonathan, as I say, is Deputy Director of Citizens UK. For those of you who don't know Citizens UK, they are a community organising foundation and an organisation that the Poverty Alliance has worked alongside for more than 10 years now, particularly around the development of the living wage in Scotland, development of the living wage campaign and accreditation. And I think we have a lot to learn and work with with Citizens UK. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody, for the welcome. And it's great to be here, not least because I've done most of my organising in Wales, building broad-based organising there. And often when we're in Wales, we look to Scotland for inspiration. You may not know this, but quite often, as we're looking around thinking about how do we think about social justice, what kind of things do, we tend not to look to Westminster, or at least haven't done for a very long time, but we often look to Scotland, not just to the devolved administrations here of various different types over various years, whether that's been around the living wage or the perspective they've taken on refugees and so on, but also in terms of what people are doing to campaign for that as well. So I hope I can offer something of our experience in Wales that may be of encouragement and of use to some of you or not, and I sort of offer it to you kind of in that way. I want to start just by offering a couple of learnings that I've had throughout my life that's brought me to organising. The brief we were given for this session was share something that inspires you or your organisation in making change. And the thing that we have at Citizens UK fundamentally is a method. Okay, we are often well known for campaigns around the living wage, or a campaign to end child detention, or whatever it might be. Some of these things very, very local, others scale up to the regional or the national or even the UK level. But fundamentally, what we're about is a method for everyday people to be able to make change. That's what kind of animates us. And I guess that's kind of the only thing I have to offer you, because the one thing I should say, I feel a bit of a fraud on the panel, we don't operate in Scotland. And we only go where we're invited. So if you want this model, we're open to having an invitation, but you'll need to extend it at some point. We'll be delighted to help you. We recently had the launch of Liverpool Citizens last week, building a new broad-based organisation there. It took them 2 years to build that organisation there. So new ones springing up all the time. But how do we get there? I'm a little bit reluctant to say this because historical references were given a bit of became a bit of a joke in this morning's session. It's not a musical one, although I do have my own little karaoke number we can throw in at some point. I want to say that the first lesson, big lesson I learned in life was that I grew up during the miners' strike in the South Wales Valley. I think most of you here at least will know what that is. Anybody remember Arthur Scargill? Yeah. My first recorded words, my dad still has them on audio cassette, were Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher. Okay. Apparently, my dad was a vicar. I used to insist on wearing a tie to church because that's what Arthur Scargill would have worn. Not convinced entirely he would have gone to church, but there we are. I grew up in a very contested context. I remember in primary school being in my primary playground, watching them landscape the tip from the colliery that had closed several years before. And look, I don't want to aggrandise coal. I don't think I'd ever wanted to be a miner, but the only reason for the community I grew up in to exist was the mining of coal. And that industry was shut down, and shut down in a way that had no regard for the people who lived up in that community. And as the bulldozers were taking that tip down, they might as well have been levelling the life chances down of every kid growing up in that community. So the first thing I learned about democracy and politics growing up was that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. Yeah? If you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. I went to school. I got very involved. I wanted to change stuff. I stood for head boy. I thought I had it nailed. I lost in a humiliating way. And my head of sixth form brought me in afterwards and said, Jonathan, you've learned a really important lesson today. And I said, what's that? He said that you were neither good-looking nor charming enough to win an election without organising. That was also a learning about how democracy works. I ended up working in Westminster for an MP and a government minister for a while. And what I learned there is that politics and democracy is too important to leave to the professionals. Okay? It's too important to leave to the professionals. They're good people, by and large, trying their best, but they cannot make the kind of change that our communities need on their own. And we cannot expect, the mantra growing up for me was, well, we just have to wait, Jonathan, until we get a Labour government in Westminster and a Labour government in the Welsh Assembly and a Labour government in a local council, and then all our problems will be solved. And that was very comforting for people during the Thatcher era. There was a long period of that, and the fundamental issues in the communities that I grew up in remain. And so what we've done about that in Wales is really think about, we cannot wait for the state. I agree with what Danny said this morning about the importance of the state in regulating the market, but the state is not powerful enough to do that on its own, and we need to do a better job in civil society to organise to try and make sure it does a better job of that. The final learning was I went to work after Westminster in the Refugee Council. I was very passionate about that issue. I was angry about how the government at the time was scapegoating asylum seekers. And I saw an organisation that did amazing casework and service delivery work and was very good at campaigning, but had no power. And so we just lost time and time and time again. And my learning there was, if you want change, you need power. Yeah? If you want change, you need power. And that's what attracted me to organising. I got involved with London Citizens at the time, which was kind of the only broad-based community organising outfit at the time. And as I went on that training, initially attracted by, how could we use this to make life better, to organise in refugee communities, to enable people to campaign and act for themselves, to be able to make change. I also began to think about, actually, we could do this in Wales. And I spent about 3 or 4 years then working with civil society organisations in Wales who invited us in, having got interested in the model as well, to look at what would it look like to have broad-based community organising in Wales. And we built it. We built a permanent alliance of civil society organisations, churches, schools, mosques, trade unions, schools, community organisations, anywhere where people gathered on a broadly voluntary basis. Probably the kids in primary school might argue about whether they're there voluntarily. And people developed together an agenda that they review democratically all the time, and they commit to working together and acting for change. And just to fast forward, what does that look like? quite a few of you today were talking about, we need to organise. What does it mean and what does it look like to organise? Well, I'll just paint you a little picture. Imagine you're walking into the First Minister's office of the Welsh Government for the first time. You've had a big accountability assembly of 700 people where you brought all your people there to do a deal with those politicians and to say, if you get elected as First Minister, will you meet with us on a regular basis to act accountably on the issues that we're putting forward to you? And we have that first meeting. And 15 of us are prepared to go in, community leaders from across Wales. And we're planning it, we role play it several times in advance to work out what we're going to do. We've got our agenda, we've got our asks, we know what happens. We turn up early, we make sure we get in the room, and it's a beautiful room. It's where the First Minister does his press conferences. It's got the nice plaque up on the wall and the flag. And there's a lovely chair that's got, like, you know, it's better than all the other ones. And we decide we're going to sit in that chair. I mean, not all 15 of us, but the person co-chairing the meeting goes and sits in that chair. And we all position ourselves around the room. And the First Minister and his entourage comes in. He's doing the glad handing. Great to see you all. And then he starts to move towards his chair. This was the previous First Minister. His chair. And he sees someone sitting in it. And he's kind of like, sort of indicating that's my chair. And our co-chair looks at him and says, this is our chair. You work for us. We're just so delighted you've made the time to meet with us. We've got an agenda. Let's get cracking. And from that moment, the entire dynamic of the meeting switched. It was at that point we got commitments to community sponsorship of refugees in Wales. We got commitments to the implementation of the living wage. And it was the basis of a relationship with Welsh Government to do something which actually you'd inspire us to do already in Scotland, which was achieve the real living wage in social care, which Wales had talked about doing for many years. But it was only through organising, consistently putting pressure on those decision makers and training people themselves, care workers sitting directly opposite the First Minister and demanding that he introduce the living wage. And not only that he do it, but how it is done, being there around the table all the way through that process of implementation. So that's what I've learned about organising. As you can see, I'm a convert to it. I think it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the world's problems. It sits alongside other ways of making change, advocacy, the lobbying stuff that you guys already do so brilliantly. But certainly we in Wales thought this was something that a string we wanted to add to our bow. And if that's something you're interested in Scotland, we'd love to have that conversation with you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks. I think there's undoubtedly appetite to learn from that experience of community organising. We'll see how that develops over the weeks and months to come. Claire Telfer has been involved in Save the Children for a number of years and leading Save the Children now for at least 5 years, I think. Save the Children, as we know, has made an enormous impact in tackling poverty globally, but also has programmes that are impactful in Scotland and across the UK as well. And I think it would be really interesting to hear, Claire, from you about what inspires you to stay involved in this work, what sustains you in this work. Over to you, Claire.
I'm just reflecting there on, I actually took a group of parents to meet with John Swinney, the First Minister, last week, and I'm deeply regretting not thinking about which chairs we were sitting in. And that maybe speaks to some of the things we've been thinking about at Save the Children. I thought I might speak today about the work we've done in the last year to think about ourselves as an organisation. We've talked a lot today about change and how to make it happen. And actually what we've done over the last year is kind of looked inward at ourselves and thought about how are we contributing to tackling poverty in Scotland and bringing about that change? Have we been part of the problem? Are we doing enough? Are we doing the right things? What do we need to do differently? So actually at the start of this year, we embarked on conversations with our community partners, with families, with funders, with people that we work with people that we don't work with, to hear what they thought. What did they think was needed in Scotland to help end child poverty? What did they think our role was? What were we doing well and what we could do differently? And it was a really inspiring exercise. Wish we could do it every year, because we were so grateful to everybody that gave us the time to share their reflections and their thoughts. But what we heard was that we do need to change and do some things differently, and that's what we've started to kind of put in process. So yes, we've got a long history of working with children and young people in Scotland and across the UK, but we really wanted to think about
you know, child poverty has become too familiar in our communities, almost too familiar to notice, and that we need to be doing more to change that. So actually we've changed our mission, and we've talked a lot today about power. So our mission was to help reduce child poverty, but we've changed that, and it's now how can we support children, young people and families to have the money, services and power they need to help end poverty. And power is really the theme that kind of runs through what we've been thinking about as an organisation. How do we give up the power, maybe not all of it, but a lot of that power, and give that and support children, families and communities better to build their power. And that's something that we've been thinking deeply about. So what is our role and how can we do that? I don't think we've got all the answers yet, and it's been really interesting hearing all the reflections today. But a couple of things that we want to focus on. One is, and we talked a little bit about this morning, I think Laura Young was talking about children and young people's voices and experiences, and where they in the debate in Scotland about tackling child poverty. And as a children's organisation, we don't feel we've done enough on that. There's brilliant examples of people sitting next to somebody who's an expert on this. But we have lots of examples of groups of children and young people doing amazing things who want to speak out and do more, but perhaps don't have the resources or the networks or the access to those in power, those decision makers, to make that difference. So what's our role in connecting up those organisations, those partners, those children and young people with those that can do something about this? And so we're really thoughtful about how we do that, and particularly thinking about that at national level and how we make sure that all the work that's happening locally is kind of connecting up, but also how we can be a better partner to grassroots activists, community organisations, organisers, those partners working in local communities who every day are supporting children and families, and thinking about, is that about capacity building? Is it about resources? Is it about our networks? And we heard really strongly from partners that actually that's something that they would like from us and like to think about what that would look like. And that will be different for different people. But the important part, I think, is that we're starting from what people are telling us that they need. And the other area that we've been thinking about, and I guess the kind of overall concept, if you like, around this is collective impact. Some of you might have heard about this. There's a lot of kind of research around social change and the different approaches to bringing that about. And our approach really is about collective impact. So it's basically saying, how can we all work together on a shared purpose to achieve that bigger change? We need the activists, we need the grassroots, we need the researchers, we need those that the thinkers that can kind of do the policy work. We need the funders, but are we all kind of working collectively together on enough of a shared goal? Do we understand the different roles we're playing and how they come together? So the other thing that we want to look at, and there's been lots of conversations I've been involved with over the last few months about civil society, the third sector in Scotland, and thinking about what is our role? How do we maybe get back to our kind of radical roots and think differently about what we could be doing? So can we help kind of convene some of that thinking and bringing people together? And for that, we need to be really clear about what we're all working towards, how we can connect and support each other and capacity build, and really understand the kind of the system. Because I think we've got great examples of individual projects, campaigns, pieces of work that we've done with families, that we've done in coalition. But actually it's about how is that all laddering up to that bigger systemic change. Poverty Alliance does some of that brilliantly already, don't they, in terms of bringing us all together today, bringing that lived and learned experience together, thinking about how we do policy and we do practice change. And we need all of that, but it is how do we coordinate better to make sure that we're all kind of adding value and thinking about that bigger picture. So those are some of the areas that we've been thinking about how we want to change as an organisation and try and put some of the things that we've been talking about today into practice. We're still learning about the best way to do that, but I hope you'll see a difference in what Save the Children's doing over the next few years that really kind of brings a lot of this to life.
Thanks, Claire. And I think that reflects a lot of the themes that we've heard today, and certainly some of the work that Danny had talked about the change in roles of big organisations in civil society, and about what our role might be in supporting change to happen more broadly across civil society. So thank you for those reflections, and it'd be good to pick up on them in our table discussions. And Mal, I'm going to turn to you now, because you have some really quite extraordinary experience to reflect on, but also your work as an activist, as a campaigner over the years since the Glasgow Girls. So over to you now for some reflections.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'll start by sharing my story of how I became an activist almost 20 years ago. I can't believe it. Back in 2005, one of my school friends, Agnesa, she was also 15. She's a Roma gypsy from Kosovo. And on a Sunday morning, 14 immigration officers went to Agnesa's flat, handcuffed her father, separated the family into 2 vans, and drove them to a detention center in England called Yarlswood, and they locked them up as if they were criminals. She was 15 and she had 2 younger siblings. Now, nobody chooses to be an asylum seeker, nobody chooses to be a refugee. For children to be treated like that, I thought that was absolutely horrendous. The UK is a country that champions human rights, so was Agnesa and her family not human? I didn't know anything about campaigning, I didn't know anything about politics, I just wanted to hang around with my pals and listen to music and dance. But when this happened, I thought, no, I need to use my voice. I need to make a difference, because that could have easily been my family being treated like that. And I went to the legend that is Mr. Garvin, Mr. G as I still call him, and I said, Mr. G, we have to do something here. It's not right. This is really wrong. And before I knew it, myself and my other friends were in the BBC News and the newspapers, sharing our story and telling the world what was going on. And thankfully, 3 weeks later, Agnesa and her family were released from detention. She's safe and happy in Glasgow, but she'll never forget the horrendous experience that she went through. And sadly, so many people are still being treated like that 20 years on. Now, I think what the campaign created was awareness about the issues that we were facing at that time, but what's really powerful about the campaign is that it wasn't just about 7 schoolgirls from Drumchapel High School, it was about the whole community coming together from all walks of life, saying you're not treating our neighbors like this, you're not treating our children like this. And 2 of my favorite people in the world are Noreen and Jean. We call them our Glaswegian grannies, because they lived in the same high-rise flats where we lived, and they would wake up every single morning to look out for the immigration vans. If they saw the vans coming, they would call every asylum seeker on the block, tell them to go and hide in the local community center while the immigration officers were going up on the lift. We need more people like Noreen and Jean. We need more people like Mr. Garvin, because we all have power. It's about recognizing that power within us and utilizing that and working together to create a movement, to create change. We were young, but we realized actually we were being listened to. And I think what we lack is that compassion and the empathy and actually really listening to people, because I think we mostly listen to respond and not listen to understand. If we listen to understand more often, this world would be very different. And at the moment, I'm working for the West of Scotland Development Education Centre. We're a global citizenship organisation, and we work with young people in schools, and we train teachers around learning for sustainability, and we do a lot of anti-racism training as well. And it's so heartening to hear the young people's ideas and voices, and they really want to create change. But again, they keep saying to me, we're not being listened to enough. Adults are not listening enough. Again and again through this work, I'm learning that this is such a big issue. And through the other freelancing work that I'm doing, I've developed a youth forum. And one of the young people told me, and it's something that will always stay with me as well, and I shared that with you, Peter, earlier. She said, silence is safe, but truth is loud. And that will stay with me. So I think for me, creating change takes all of us. To make change happen. Like I said earlier, it wasn't just about the schoolgirls coming together, it was actually about the whole village coming together and saying, no, we need to make a difference, and we will make a difference together. And it's taking the small steps that lead to big change. It could be really disheartening, it could be really tough at times. We went through a roller coaster ride campaigning because 1 minute we won with Agnesa, but the second minute we lost the Vukash family. They were getting up to put the uniform to go to school. The dawn raid happened and they were taken. Didn't see them again. So that's what makes the story realistic as well. We didn't always win, but we keep on going. And what gives me faith and hope is the community action, is the people that make the difference. And like I said before, nobody gives you power, you already have the power. It's about actually saying, what can I do with that? Because we all have a responsibility to make a difference, and we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amal. I think 20 years on, that story of the Glasgow girls is still inspiring and is something that we need to hold on to. I think there was many things that you said there that it would be good for us to reflect on. Perhaps we can, we'll have some time at the end for a bit more discussion with our panel. But I think that need to listen and to understand, again, is a theme that I think has emerged through our discussions today about what we actually mean when we engage with communities. And I think that message that, you know, we don't always win, but we keep on going. I think, again, that's something from community organising, from citizen organising that we learn as well, is that we don't always win, but we need to have the structures and the processes in place and the capacity that when we lose, we can figure out how we win the next time and how we win better the next time. So, with all that said, you've heard some, I think, inspiring words, some reflections on how people have made change happen. What we want to do now is go into our table discussion. So if any of you are at tables that are light in numbers, join with some of your colleagues. And we're going to have 3 questions, which I don't know if they're not up on the screen, so I'll tell you them. I don't know if they can be up on the screen. But so the first one, and there should, hopefully, many of your tables, maybe not at all, but a Poverty Alliance colleague to help guide the discussion along. But what is it that inspires you or gives you hope? Maybe thinking about some of what you've heard today, but what is it that inspires you or gives you hope? And what will you or your organisation do after today to make change? And that might be continuing to do the things that you've done. It might be doubling down on some of the things that you do already, or thinking about, well, actually, what do we do differently? And then finally, I know they're up there now, what support do you need from the Poverty Alliance to make change happen? So the Poverty Alliance is a resource. We do provide support, I think, to lots of organisations. We have convening power. What is it that we can do more of in the coming years to really genuinely build a movement? What is it your organisations need from the Poverty Alliance as a network? So we've got maybe about 15, 20 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, to have that discussion. So have the discussion. We'll have a little bit of feedback, not every table, but a little bit of feedback, and then we'll go back to our panel. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Should we go and join tables?
Just another couple of minutes before I start asking for feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. Depends who's on the table, I suppose. But
Okay. I always hate bringing these kind of conversations to an end, but unfortunately I have to bring these conversations to an end just now. So hopefully you've had enough time to get through those three really quite big, chunky questions. So what we'll do is we'll take just a little bit of feedback, just to get a flavour of some of the discussions. Obviously, they're all being captured. A report will be written in due course, and you can see the results of that. But just for now, I think, just to get a bit of a flavour of what people have been talking about in response to these questions, then we'll go back to our panel to get some final reflections on them of what they've heard and how we want to take this forward. So, if I could maybe, I'm sorry to my colleagues at the Poverty Alliance, but I'm just going to pick on people at random. Could Chloe, I can see Chloe up there. Would you like to just give us, yeah, sorry, you need a microphone. Briefly, the key things that your table will say in terms of inspiring hope, what they'll do next, and what support we need.
Absolutely, yes. So we had a really full conversation, so I'll pick out just some key things. Key for us in inspiration and hope was listening to stories from other organisations, and particularly hearing about wins and progress from other organisations, and that way that we can feel power from that and get ideas on how to organise ourselves moving forward. We didn't necessarily speak to the second question, but in terms of the third question, we had lots and lots of ideas thinking about, we had a specific example about the Investing in Communities Fund. That's a real struggle for organisations, so perhaps some way to collectively organise and lobby around that. Thinking about capacity building around tax and tax reform, utilising the Tax Justice Now campaign, and thinking about how we can simplify language, capacity build in our communities around that. Really thinking about the benefit of in-person events and forums, and also thinking about how the Poverty Alliance can support comms capacity for organisations, thinking particularly about things like social media takeovers, so thinking about how members could utilise our Instagram, for example. We also talked about the benefit that TikTok might have as well, so TikTok takeovers. Future TikToks.
Yeah, there's been a few of us talking about TikTok this afternoon, and we're going to do a little teach-in on that later on. So if anyone wants to stay afterwards, we can do that. Thanks very much, Chloe. And maybe, Annie, I see you have a microphone, so you're ready to go.
Yes, so for inspiration, we talked a little bit about how narratives that change over time, so thinking about how the vote for women, people were vilified for that back in the day, and now they're heroes. So a little bit of hope that maybe time changes the narrative, but also how it's not as hard to make changes as you might think. We're thinking a little bit about the tax workshop we were at this morning. Also finding inspiration in things like the Scottish child payment and how that change happened to mitigate other policies, and how important that was. How important solidarity is in terms of inspiration, and that the lead comes from the people, and a great quote from Che Guevara about the people liberating themselves, and lots of other chat. And then we talked about making change, thanks so much, about outreach, door knocking, speaking to people, going to people where they are, community organising, but also then talking about how Poverty Alliance can help some of these things through networking, things like today, how much value people find to listen to the speakers today as well, membership meetings that we run being really valuable, and also maybe thinking about how MSPs could be in this space but listening rather than talking, so at the discussion tables listening rather than being on the stage talking.
Thanks very much, Annie. And Ralph, if you want to give a little bit of feedback. And then we'll maybe take a couple of comments from the audience as well, just before we go back to the panel. But Ralph.
Great. Okay. So we were particularly struck by, well, all of what Amal said, but particularly the two sort of quotes, I guess. Silence is safe, but truth is loud. And, I think we all felt that was a really powerful thing to take away, but also listening to understand, not listening to respond. And I guess, in a sense, we were all inspired by that, but also kind of giving us food for thought in terms of how we take that into our own work. We also, like Chloe's group, at the sort of the small wins that we've heard about, well, small is not the right term, but kind of perhaps the hidden wins or the less heralded wins, like the Stratham bus that we heard about this morning, being inspired to hear about those and to remember that kind of things are changing all the time, as I think you said, and sometimes they are changing for the better. In terms of what we'll take into our organisations and our own work, a couple of highlights, I guess. One very specific one around building new connections with schools, having heard a lot about the role of schools and education in our communities. And then a kind of general point around trying to move away from top-down thinking in our organisation, in particular in the context of that sort of change to listening to understand, not listening to respond. And in terms of support from the Poverty Alliance, we talked about things that the Poverty Alliance already does that kind of might want to continue or more of in terms of training, but also providing things like statistics and information on poverty, and a kind of ask to help us educate people about poverty. Thanks, Ralph.
Just before we go back to our panel, is there anyone who would like to make any final reflections themselves? And we've heard a lot of really excellent points fed back there, but any just brief points? Don't feel compelled if you don't want to. Okay, that's what happens when I spring things on people. Shouldn't do that. So, going to turn to our panel now, just for some final reflections on the kind of feedback that you've heard there about what gives people hope or inspires them. What are your reflections on what you've heard from that little bit of feedback and the discussions you're involved in? Maybe just start the same way, Jonathan, if we start with you.
I went first last time. I'll negotiate that.
It looks like we're in a negotiation situation here. I'm happy to go with you first, Jonathan, and finish with Amal.
Okay. Lost that negotiation. It's because we've got no broad-based organisation in Scotland, you see, otherwise I would have been able to negotiate a position.
That's not what it is, Jonathan. That's not what it is.
Yeah, it was great to be on the table with the Justice and Peace guys and to hear kind of their reflections. They're kind of on a theme with the things that I've heard kind of throughout the day, really, which is kind of, in organising we talk about our vision of the world as it should be and our experience of the world as it is and the emotional reaction we often feel, the anger, the grief that we feel when our vision of the world as it should be is compromised by our experience of the world as it is. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do with it? And there are lots of different things we can do with it, or not. We can choose to just ignore it or suppress it or kind of hope it goes away. And there seems to be quite a lot of kind of yearning of, well, I wish we had the power to be able to kind of make the change that we want to do. So I suppose I'll just close my reflections about thinking about that a little bit. So organising, again, is about building power, and you can't wish power into being. Okay? Sometimes we think of power as like some abstract thing that just exists, and some people have it, politicians or decision makers, and we don't. One of the things I've loved hearing from lots of different people on the panel and around the room is people saying, actually, we do have some power. I think, Amal, you said this. We do have some power. We define power as the ability to act. Okay? The ability to act. I think the thing that is radical and liberating about that definition is that, yeah, okay, we don't all have the same amounts of power, but we all have some. We all have some. And kind of what we try and do in organising is build relational power. That is the power that comes when different people and organisations agree to work together for the common good. And you can grow that kind of power. It's not zero sum. The more people, the more organisations, the more power, the more kind of change you can bring about. So that's power. What about justice, which is another thing that we've heard a lot about today? Desmond Tutu had this wonderful little saying, which I find really agitational. I think he was saying it as an agitation to the church. He was an archbishop. He said, sometimes we have to stop just picking people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. And I think the implication was, do something about it. Okay? That is the difference between charity and justice. He's not, by the way, saying, don't ever do any charity or charity is terrible. He's saying that charity is not sufficient. So my slight agitation to myself and to everyone here is, how much time are we as individuals or our organizations investing in building power for justice versus pulling people out of the river? Because there will always be too many people in the river for us to ever have enough people in our institutions to effectively pull out. But going upstream takes time. It's difficult. It's more controversial. It kind of feels easier and more immediately gratifying to pull people out the river than to do that hard organizing work. And it takes time to do. So final few offers of things you could do that are accessible to you now. The first thing is think about your own time. How much are you your organisations spending in terms of that justice charity balance? Could you make a small designation of time to do some time towards building relational power each week? Could you meet with 3 new people, not to meet their needs, but to find out, to listen, to understand, not to respond, but to find out what drives them, what motivates them, where is the common ground that you could potentially organise around? We call them relational meetings or one-to-ones, and organisers like Sarah and myself have to do three of those every day as part of our organising practice. That helps us build relational power. Imagine if everybody here maybe didn't do 3 a day, but did 3 a week. The kind of power we could build, the relationships we could grow, could be really substantial. The second thing is you could think about training. We run organising training. Sarah mentioned the 6-day training that we offer earlier. We also do 3-day online training. We can come and do training here in Scotland if we're invited to do so. Another thing you could think about, we are currently, I mentioned Liverpool Citizens has just founded. We have got what are called sponsoring committees in Lancashire, Bristol, Cambridge, Hull, Sheffield, and Sweden at the moment. Groups of people and organisations are like, this organising thing sounds kind of interesting. We're not entirely sure about it, but we're committed to work together to explore it and think about, is this the right thing for our patch? Would we like to have organising here? And if so, what would it mean to make that happen? There is no reason why Scotland or people and communities in Scotland couldn't do the same thing. And the final thing is, in Wales, we're facing elections in 2026 for our Senedd. We're pretty terrified about it. We've got a new electoral system that is going to play into the hands of Reform. Reform are currently polling. We're a non-partisan organisation, but we are really worried about a society and a country that continues to be welcoming to people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And we are really worried about the impact of that kind of election. We're starting to think about our organising strategy now. We're starting to think about getting people registered to vote. It was great to work with the Poverty Alliance this year on our voter registration champion scheme for the UK general election. Maybe there could be some interesting opportunities there for you guys to dip your toes into experimenting with organising in the run-up to the elections, and we'd be well up for working with you on those. So I hope those provide some practical ways in which you can take some action for hope.
Thanks very much, John. Claire.
I think one of the things I'm thinking about is how we diversify bringing newer and older voices together. There's lots of familiar faces in the room, but there's also lots of new voices as well, and I think it's really important that we have both of those things. And are we listening to everybody that needs to be part of this conversation? How do we reach out to perhaps some of the more marginalised voices who are not as represented in the room? So I think that's something that we need to think about, and I think that makes what we're doing so much the richer. So I think that's thinking, but that's also about power as well, and how we're kind of unlocking and shifting power, not only you know between us as much as anything else, and how we work together. I wanted to also reflect on some of the, I think it was this table that was talking about kind of how narratives change. So I wanted to highlight some of the work that Save the Children's doing at the moment around public attitudes. So I think part of the picture that we need to understand in order to make real progress on tackling poverty in Scotland is understanding what the Scottish public thinks about these issues. And actually that makes me quite hopeful, because over the last year we've been doing lots of research, we've done polling, we've done a citizens' assembly. That work is just being pulled together at the moment, but over 80% of people in Scotland think child poverty is a big issue and we need to be doing more about it. I think it's actually over 85% support action on some of the big drivers of poverty: housing, childcare, better paid jobs. It's a little bit lower on social security, but it's still around 65% would support action. So actually the work that we've been doing to understand where we are as a country, we're turning that into, well, how then do we talk about poverty? How do we talk about some of these issues to bring more people with us? I think one of my reflections would be the sustainability of action around particularly I'm thinking about child poverty. The UK government had targets to end child poverty by 2020 that were very easily swept away when government changed at Westminster. We've currently got 2030 targets for Scotland. I do not want to be sitting here and having 2040 targets. So really thinking about how we build sustainable change is about understanding the broader public and how we bring more people along on that journey with us. So the work we're doing, I think, is giving me hope, because I think there is support to do more. And we hope over the next few months to turn that into a resource that all of us can use, about how we talk about some of these issues, how we say things, what we say and how we say them are really important to bring people with us. And that's part of the kind of power dynamics as well. So I hope that will be a useful contribution and something quite practical that will enable us to drive things forward as well.
Thanks, Peter. I'd like to reflect on what this table said in terms of solidarity. And solidarity is so important, because who are we without each other? You know, and we're all at different stages in life. And the way I see my work, and in particularly my activism, that it's a journey. And during that journey, we go through different stages and opportunities, and it's those opportunities that we can either say it's just for us, or actually no, it's for all of us, and how I can encourage other people to join me on that platform and to share the story and the power of stories as well. For me, I see it in two sides: is the education side of the work that I do, and then the other side is using the arts to tell stories. Because we briefly chatted about how we don't want to preach at people, we want to work with people, and to actually really, again, going back to what I said earlier, really listening to understand and having that compassion and empathy. And it's there, we just need to continue working on it. And I think events like this today, bringing people together, is so important. And I'm really glad we're back to doing this after going through a period of time where we weren't doing this. But there is so much change happening, and we need to hear about those positive stories. I don't think we hear enough about what's good that's happening in the world, because it can be really sad to see what's going on. But it's those powerful stories that give us the hope and the encouragement to make a difference. And definitely when we're united and working together using our different skills and resources, we can definitely make a difference. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you all our speakers for those final thoughts and reflections. We're almost at 4 o'clock, so it's my job to make sure you get out of here as soon as possible. There's so much to reflect on from today. I think it's been just across the piece, fantastic discussions taking place. There are many quotes that I've written down that I will reflect on more, and we can, as I said, there will be a report to conclude this. There was something that Gordon McRae from Shelter said in the workshop earlier that I picked up on, and he was talking about changing the political tolerance to the housing crisis amongst the public in Scotland. And I think that's something that we could apply to all aspects of poverty in Scotland, changing the political tolerance, the fact that we simply accept, too often, we simply accept that this is the way it is, these are the levels of inequality we have, this is the level of poverty that we have, and we can change it little bits around the edge, but you know, that's just the way it is. I think Claire has just provided us with some of the evidence to say that actually people think that isn't acceptable, but we need to build to make greater action come from that. And I think we've heard, you know, in great volume today about the different approaches that are there for us to make change, from community organising to better use of our insider policy work, to changing the narrative, to using digital more creatively. There are lots of things that we need to do. And as I've said a couple of times now, we will gather our learning together from this conference. We will produce a report that will have actions in it. But for the poverty lines, we have been working for the last 6 months or so on thinking about what is the big next step we need to take. And we've settled around this idea of activating our network more ambitiously over the next year, over the coming year. And that's what we will be setting to do coming from this conference, using the learning that we have from this conference. We will be looking at how do we activate our network, how do we support our network, how do we broaden it and make it bigger. It is much bigger than it was a couple of years ago, but how do we grow it still? How do we match that growth in our network with far more bold, far more stretching demands on government? How do we manifest that demand to government? 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, we had a conference on making change happen. Back then, part of that led to the development of Challenge Poverty Week, which has certainly raised the tempo in terms of poverty in Scotland. We need to do something similar again. So we're looking towards next year, next October, to have something far bigger, far grander. Next year is an important year. We'll be developing a new child poverty strategy in Scotland. We'll be still in the depths of a housing crisis. We need clearly to organise our resources and put them to greater use, and we need to demand more from our government. So whether it's in community organising, whether it's in using digital better, we will be doing more. And I sincerely hope that all of you will be part of that and very active parts of that, of making change happen next year. Now all it remains for me to do is do a big long list of thank yous. I'll try and keep them quite tight. So thanks firstly to the staff team at the Poverty Alliance, particularly to Ruth and the policy team who did so much work to prepare the conference, also to the admin team, to Sinead and Paul and all the admin team who have made this run so smoothly throughout the day. Of course, a big thank you to all of our speakers. Both our panels were fantastic, but the workshops, I think, were of an incredibly high standard throughout the day. Thank you to all our board members and trustees who have been with us throughout the day and who've actively taken a part in helping us deliver the conference today. Thank you also to the staff team at the conference centre. I think they've done a fantastic job, so thank you to all of those. Final thing, I think, unless someone notifies me that I've forgotten something, but evaluation. So you'll be emailed an evaluation. There's a QR code, I think, that you can use to get access to that evaluation form. It's really important that we understand what worked for you today and what didn't, so that we can do it better in the future. And that's it. We'll see you all, not next year, much sooner than that. One thing to say is that for those of you who are members of the Poverty Alliance, there'll be an AGM, because you'll note this isn't an AGM. There'll be an AGM at the end of February. You'll be hearing more about that just next week. For those of you who aren't Poverty Alliance members, then please do join us. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your weekends. Enjoy the season. See you all again soon.